The boarding gate was packed, but for the Carter family, it should have been a routine flight. First-class seats direct to Los Angeles. Instead, they stood face-to-face with a flight attendant who refused to let them board. "Sorry, but first class is for premium passengers only," Karen Whitmore said, crossing her arms. James Carter, calm as ever, handed over their boarding passes. "We are in first class." Karen barely glanced at them before shaking her head. There must be a mistake. Vanessa Carter, poised but firm, arched a brow. And what mistake would that be? Karen sighed dramatically. It happens all the time. Some people buy economy and try to sneak up. A few passengers glanced over, watching. The Carters weren't just being stopped, they were being humiliated. James exhaled slowly, slipping his phone from his pocket. "Richard," he said, calling a number. "We have a situation on one of our flights." Karen laughed. A fake call. How cute. But then, her earpiece crackled to life. "Karen, step away from those passengers immediately." Her smirk faded, because what she was about to learn would change everything. James Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping a black coffee as he scrolled through emails on his tablet. The airport terminal buzzed around him, families rushing to their gates, business travelers making last-minute calls, flight announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. His wife, Vanessa Carter, sat beside him, effortlessly elegant in a tailored cream jumpsuit, reviewing a document on her laptop. Unlike James, whose focus was on operations and expansion, Vanessa handled the big picture: strategy, branding, and making sure Carter Aviation remained an industry leader. Across from them, their two teenagers, Jordan and Maya, shared a pair of wireless headphones, watching a video on Jordan's phone. They had grown up with luxury but never entitlement, taught that success was earned, not given. They could have been any well-dressed upper-class family flying first class. Except they weren't just flying Carter Aviation, they owned it. James Carter wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in a small apartment in Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. His first encounter with airplanes was watching them take off from a rooftop, dreaming of a life where he could afford to be on one. He worked his way up, from airport janitor to baggage handler, to a pilot, and eventually an airline executive. When he saw that big airlines treated customers like numbers, he knew he could do better. So, alongside Vanessa, he built Carter Aviation from the ground up. Now, it was worth billions. But the Carters never flaunted their success. No private jets, no bodyguards, just first-class tickets like any other paying passenger. It was how they stayed connected to their customers, their employees, and the real-world experience of flying. Which was why today was supposed to be just another flight from New York to Los Angeles. Instead, it was about to become a lesson in why power should never be underestimated. "Attention! First-class passengers for Flight 827. We are now boarding." James stood, tucking his tablet into his carry-on. Vanessa closed her laptop, and Jordan and Maya put their headphones away. They walked toward the gate, handing over their first-class boarding passes, but instead of scanning them, the flight attendant frowned. Her name tag read Karen Whitmore. She had been with the airline for years. She prided herself on knowing the right kind of passengers, the ones who belonged in first class. And, in her mind, the Carters weren't them. She stepped in front of them, blocking their way. "First class is for premium passengers only," she said. James raised an eyebrow. "We know. We're in first class." Karen barely glanced at their boarding passes before shaking her head. There must be a mistake. Vanessa inhaled slowly, keeping her composure razor-sharp. And what mistake would that be? Karen crossed her arms. "It happens all the time. Some people buy economy tickets and try to sneak up." A few passengers turned to watch. She wasn't just questioning them, she was humiliating them. James sighed, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. "Richard, we have a situation on one of our flights." Karen smirked. But seconds later, her earpiece crackled to life. "Karen, step away from those passengers immediately." Her face drained of color. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Karen Whitmore had worked as a flight attendant for over a decade, and in that time, she had developed a skill: spotting problems before they started. To her, problems came in different forms: passengers who drank too much, those who complained too loudly, and, on rare occasions, those who tried to sneak into first class when they clearly didn't belong. And now, standing in front of her, she was convinced she had found one: the Carter family. James Carter stood tall and composed, his suit perfectly tailored. Vanessa Carter exuded grace and quiet authority, her expression unreadable. Their two teenage children, Jordan and Maya, stood beside them, looking bored but patient. And yet none of it registered to Karen the way it should have. She didn't see one of the wealthiest families in the country. She didn't see the owners of the very airline she worked for. She just saw people who didn't fit her idea of first-class passengers. "First class is for premium passengers only," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. James extended his boarding pass again, his patience wearing thin. "And we are premium passengers." Karen didn't take it. Instead, she let out a small, practiced sigh, the kind meant for customers who just wouldn't take no for an answer. "Sir, I understand, but sometimes people purchase economy tickets and try to board first class. It happens all the time." Vanessa's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "Are you saying we don't belong here?" Karen folded her arms. "I'm saying there's likely been a mix-up." James let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, the only mix-up I see is you refusing to scan our tickets." Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. By now, other passengers were watching. A few whispered, some glanced over cautiously, sensing the growing tension. Karen felt it too, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You know what?" she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Let me verify this with my supervisor." Before James could respond, she turned her back on them and activated her radio. "Security. I need an officer at Gate 32. The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Jordan and Maya exchanged a look, realizing this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. Vanessa let out a slow breath, closing her eyes briefly before turning to James. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. James exhaled sharply. "This is discrimination." Karen overheard that and spun back around, her face flushing. "Sir, I'm just following protocol." James took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "No, you're following your assumptions." Karen felt her stomach tighten, but she wouldn't let this man intimidate her. She turned toward the gate desk, motioning toward a junior flight attendant, Michael, who had been observing from a distance. "Michael, can you check the system and confirm their tickets?" Michael hesitated. See, he knew exactly who the Carters were. He had seen their names before, heard executives mention them. He even recognized James Carter from a company-wide leadership video played during training. This wasn't just some wealthy family. This was the family. Michael leaned in slightly, whispering, "Karen, you should—" But Karen cut him off. "I've got this." Michael winced. Because no, she didn't. James pulled out his phone and dialed. Karen crossed her arms, smirking. Was he really going to call his friend to get past security? Pathetic. "Hey, Richard," James said into the phone. "We have a situation on one of our flights." Karen rolled her eyes. That was when her earpiece crackled. "Karen," a voice said urgently. It was her supervisor. She smiled to herself. Finally. "Yes, I'm handling a situation right now," she responded coolly. The voice cut her off. "Step away from those passengers. Now." Karen's smirk vanished. There was a long pause. Then her supervisor spoke again, this time quieter, almost fearful. "Karen." You just tried to remove the owners of Carter Aviation from their own plane." Karen's heart dropped. She froze, her face draining of color. Michael winced again. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something had just changed. Karen looked up and met James Carter's eyes. He wasn't smiling. Neither was Vanessa, because they had seen this 1,000 times before. Karen opened her mouth, trying to speak, but before she could say a word, the airport manager came running. Michael had seen a lot in his time as a flight attendant: angry passengers, entitled travelers, even the occasional celebrity trying to slip onto a flight unnoticed. But never had he seen a mistake this big unfolding in real time. He had been watching from the gate desk, quietly observing as Karen dug herself deeper into a situation she clearly didn't understand. And now, she was seconds away from making a career-ending mistake. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Karen." She waved him off without looking. "I've got this." Michael clenched his jaw. No, she didn't. His eyes darted to James Carter, whose expression remained calm but unreadable. Vanessa, poised as ever, was watching with the silent patience of someone who had seen this scenario play out too many times before. And that's when Michael knew. This wasn't the first time the Carters had been treated this way. It was just the first time someone was about to pay for it. James sighed, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He had given Karen every chance to correct herself. She refused. "Vanessa," he said quietly, turning to his wife, "call Lillian." Karen let out a sharp laugh. "You're calling someone else now?" Vanessa didn't acknowledge her. She was already dialing. Michael swallowed hard. Lillian Pierce. He knew that name. Everyone in Carter Aviation did. She wasn't just James Carter's assistant, she was his right hand. If Lillian was getting involved, this wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was a problem. Karen checked her watch, impatient. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we resolve this." James stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Sure." He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because Karen had no idea what was coming next. Lillian answered on the first ring. "Mr. Carter," she said, already aware something was wrong. Vanessa kept her voice even, but sharp. "We're being denied boarding on Flight 827. The flight attendant refuses to scan our tickets." Lillian went silent. Then, "Give me 1 minute." Karen rolled her eyes. Michael resisted the urge to put his head in his hands. This was bad. 1 minute later, the airport manager himself came sprinting toward the gate, his face flushed, sweating through his shirt. Passengers turned, watching the commotion. Karen smiled, relieved. Finally, someone would back her up. Then the manager skidded to a stop and turned straight to James Carter. "Mr. Carter, I am so sorry for this." Karen's stomach dropped. "Wait. What?" The manager snapped his gaze to Karen. "You are relieved of duty. Immediately." Karen went pale. Passengers whispered in confusion. Michael took 1 step back, wanting no part of this. Karen tried to sputter out a response. I don't understand. What's going on?" The manager's voice was low but furious. "These are the owners of Carter Aviation." Karen's entire body locked up. Her pulse pounded. She slowly turned toward James Carter, who hadn't moved. She had spent the last 10 minutes humiliating the man who signed her paycheck. Her chest tightened. She wanted to speak, to fix it, to explain. But it was too late, because her world had just crashed. Karen smirked as she pressed the button on her radio. "Security, I need an officer at gate 32. Her voice carried a satisfied edge, as if she had finally put an end to the nonsense. The Carters weren't being cooperative, and in her mind, this was the only way to handle them. Michael winced, watching this all unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Karen had no idea she was seconds away from ruining her career. Inside Carter Aviation's corporate headquarters, Lillian Pierce moved like a storm. She had just gotten off the phone with Vanessa Carter, and within seconds, executives were alerted. This wasn't just an incident. This was a disaster. Get the CEO on the line, now. In less than a minute, the head of Carter Aviation, Richard Gaines, was racing toward the private runway, already panicking. Karen had no idea, but the entire company was now watching her mistake in real time. 2 security officers appeared at the gate within minutes, their presence drawing even more attention. Karen folded her arms, confident she had won. "There," she said smugly. "These passengers are trying to board first class without authorization." One of the officers turned to the airport manager, who had arrived moments earlier and looked like he was about to explode. The security guard hesitated. "What's going on here?" The manager took a deep breath, then turned to Karen. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice tight with fury. Karen blinked. What?" she asked, laughing nervously. "Sir, I was just following—" "Step aside." The entire gate fell silent. Michael held his breath. Karen's face twisted in confusion. Why was no one backing her up? That's when Richard Gaines, the CEO of Carter Aviation, burst through the terminal, his face red from running. Passengers turned to stare. A CEO didn't just show up at an airport gate unless something serious had happened. Karen's stomach tightened. The security guard stepped back. The manager took a slow, deep breath and looked directly at Karen. Then he said the words that made her entire world crumble. "Karen, these are the owners of Carter Aviation." Karen felt the ground beneath her shift. Her heart stopped. She looked up at James Carter, the man she had been arguing with for the past 15 minutes. He wasn't smiling. Neither was Vanessa. Her breath hitched. Her brain raced to process what was happening. No, this couldn't be right. She had spent her entire career dreaming of climbing the ranks of the airline industry. And now, she had just humiliated the people at the very top. Her bosses. The people who had the power to fire her on the spot. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, to fix this. But before she could utter a single word, Richard Gaines spoke first. "Karen Whitmore," the CEO said, his voice cold. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately." Karen's vision blurred. The passengers were still watching. Michael took another small step back, distancing himself from the implosion happening before his eyes. Karen swallowed hard, trying to process what she had done. Her chest felt tight. Her knees felt weak. She had spent the last 15 minutes humiliating the most powerful people in the airline industry. And now, she had just lost everything. Karen felt numb. The words, "You are relieved of duty," kept echoing in her mind, but her brain refused to accept them. This wasn't happening. This was supposed to be her moment of control, the moment where she proved herself as a no-nonsense flight attendant who knew how to handle troublemakers. But instead, she had just lost her job in front of a crowd of passengers, security, and her entire team. And they were all watching. She turned to the CEO, eyes pleading. "Sir, please, I was just following protocol," she stammered, her voice breaking. Richard Gaines didn't even look at her. His focus was on James and Vanessa Carter, and the weight of that moment settled like a brick in Karen's chest. Because in that moment she realized she was invisible. She didn't matter. Not anymore. Phones were already raised, cameras recording every moment. Passengers whispered in shock, some in satisfaction. "Wait, are you telling me that flight attendant just tried to kick the owners of the airline off their own plane? Oh, she's done for. I got the whole thing on video. This is going viral." Karen snapped her head around, panic flaring in her chest. Her voice pitched higher. "Can you all stop recording?" she demanded, but her words only made people film more. Vanessa Carter, still poised, glanced at her husband and then turned back to Richard Gaines. "This isn't just about us," she said. "This is about how many other passengers have been mistreated under her watch, and others like her." Karen's stomach dropped. What was she implying? Gaines nodded slowly. We're going to launch a full-scale investigation into customer service practices immediately. Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. An investigation? This wasn't just about her getting fired. This was about exposing the way she, and maybe others, had treated passengers. She thought losing her job was the worst of it. She was so wrong. By the time Karen made it out of the airport, Twitter was already on fire. Breaking. Flight attendant humiliates black billionaire family, tries to remove them from first class without realizing they own the airline. Carter aviation scandal. Watch. This flight attendant really thought she could power trip on the Carter family. Now she's unemployed. Instant karma. This happens to black travelers all the time. The only difference? The Carters had power to fight back, but what about the people who don't? Karen gasped in horror as she scrolled through the posts. Her face was all over the internet. Her name was trending. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a scandal. A career-ending scandal. She had never felt so small. That evening, Carter Aviation released an official statement. Carter Aviation is committed to ensuring that all passengers receive fair and respectful treatment. Effective immediately, we are launching an internal review of our customer service policies, including mandatory bias training for all employees. Karen stared at the words, her hands shaking. Mandatory bias training. She knew exactly what that meant. She had become the example, the warning, the face of what not to do. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from former co-workers, some from reporters, some from people she had never met, all demanding answers. But there were no answers. There was only one terrible truth. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline industry. And now, she had just thrown it all away. Karen sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her phone screen. Her name was everywhere. Fire Karen was trending. News articles, blog posts, and viral videos replayed her downfall over and over again. Breaking. Flight attendant kicked a black billionaire family off their own plane. Carter Aviation responds. Watch. This flight attendant humiliated herself on a global scale. This is why racial bias training needs to happen in every industry. She thought she had power, until real power showed up. Karen's breath was shallow as she scrolled through the never-ending flood of comments. She deserves to be fired. I hope no airline hires her again. She had no problem kicking them off until she found out who they were. Her hands clenched around her phone. This wasn't fair. A small spark of rage ignited in her chest. She wasn't going to just sit here and let people destroy her reputation. She had to fight back. She opened Twitter and typed furiously, Karen Whitmore at Karen Whitmore Official. I was just doing my job. The Carters set me up for failure. I was following protocol, and now I'm being villainized for it. This isn't about bias. It's about them flexing their power. She hit POST. For a second, she felt relieved. Finally, she had spoken her truth. But that relief didn't last. Because within minutes, the internet exploded again. Set you up? Lady, they tried to board a plane they own. You did this to yourself. She really tried to play the victim. Incredible. So you didn't know who they were, but you still assumed they didn't belong? Make it make sense. The comments kept coming. This is the worst apology I've ever seen. No accountability, just excuses. She's proving exactly why she got fired. Karen's face turned red as she scrolled. Every tweet, every reply, every video, it was all against her. She had thought that playing the victim would save her, but it only made things worse. The next morning, Karen woke up to a message from a lawyer. Carter Aviation was taking legal action. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She read the email again, then again, hoping she had misread it. But no, it was clear. She had blamed the Carters, and now they were fighting back. This wasn't just losing her job. This was about to cost her everything. James Carter sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by his top executives. The skyline of Atlanta stretched beyond the glass windows behind him, but his focus was locked on the documents in front of him, reports of customer complaints, employee misconduct, and bias incidents within Carter Aviation. Vanessa Carter leaned forward, flipping through pages. "This isn't just about Karen Whitmore." James nodded. "No, it's not." Karen had been the spark, but the fire had been burning for a long time. Passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had been piling up for years. They weren't just going to fire one flight attendant and move on. They were about to change the entire airline industry. Richard Gaines, the airline's CEO, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, we've already removed Whitmore from her position. The media storm will die down soon. I'm not sure—" James cut him off. "We're not just dealing with one employee. We're dealing with a system that allowed this to happen." Vanessa slid a report across the table. "Our airline has received over 200 complaints of racial bias from customers in the past 5 years. How many of those were actually investigated?" Gaines swallowed hard. Silence. James let the question hang before speaking again. "Starting immediately, Carter Aviation will implement a mandatory anti-bias training program for all employees. Flight attendants, ground staff, security, every single person who interacts with a passenger." An executive raised a hand hesitantly. "How in-depth are we talking?" James's voice was calm but firm. "We don't do surface-level fixes." Vanessa leaned forward. "This training will be continuous, not a one-time thing. Every employee will be required to pass an assessment every 6 months. If they fail, they don't work here." Murmurs rippled through the room. No airline had ever enforced something like this before. But then again, no airline had ever been in a scandal this big. And the Carters weren't just putting out a fire. They were rewriting the rule book. Vanessa placed another file on the table. "There's something else." The executive straightened. James tapped the cover. "Starting next quarter, we'll be launching a mystery flyer program." Confused looks spread across the room. "What's that?" someone asked. Vanessa explained. "We'll be hiring anonymous evaluators to fly our routes, posing as everyday passengers. Their job will be to monitor customer service, how they're treated, if there's bias, if employees follow protocol correctly." One executive's face paled. "So, we're sending undercover testers?" "Exactly," James said. A different executive hesitated. "What happens if an employee fails?" James's eyes darkened. "They're retrained. If they fail again, they're gone." Vanessa clasped her hands together. "This isn't about punishing people. It's about making sure this never happens again." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Because they knew some of their employees weren't going to make it through this new system. And the Carters, they were okay with that. James turned to Richard Gaines. "Issue a statement." The CEO nodded, already pulling out his phone. Vanessa crossed her arms. "We're not just addressing this internally. We're setting a new standard for the airline industry. We have heard the voices of our passengers. Effective immediately, Carter Aviation will be implementing a mandatory anti-bias training program and launching a new mystery flyer initiative to ensure fair and respectful treatment for all travelers. Discrimination has no place in our airline or anywhere in the industry." Within minutes, the statement was trending. The world wasn't just watching. The world was cheering. Other airlines scrambled to respond. Delta Airlines. "We stand with Carter Aviation's commitment to fairness and will be reviewing our own policies immediately." American Airlines. "We commend Carter Aviation for setting a new industry standard. More airlines should follow suit." United Airlines. "Bias in air travel is a real issue. We're watching Carter Aviation closely and evaluating our own training programs." The Carters hadn't just changed their airline. They had forced an entire industry to wake up. Meanwhile, Karen sat in her apartment scrolling through the news. Her hands trembled as she read the headlines. Carter Aviation implements tough new anti-bias training, and the airline industry is following suit. Watch. Carter Airlines Mystery Flyer. Program exposes hidden bias in customer service. Karen's throat felt dry. She had thought she was the only one facing consequences. But now, every flight attendant, every airport worker, every security officer, they were all being watched. Her mistake hadn't just ended her career, it had changed the entire system. And for the first time since this all began, Karen realized just how big of a mistake she had made. Karen sat at her kitchen table, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. It was official. Carter Aviation was suing her for defamation. Her heart pounded as she skimmed the legal jargon, her vision blurring. The lawsuit outlined everything: her false accusations, the damage to the company's reputation, and the financial impact of her claims. She had tried to blame the Carters for what happened. Now they were holding her accountable. Her stomach twisted as she reached the bottom of the letter. The estimated damages? $500,000. Karen's breath hitched. She didn't have that kind of money. She didn't have any money. Legal fees alone would wipe out her savings. She grabbed her phone and frantically searched for a lawyer, but every firm she called had the same answer. This case is too high profile, we can't take it on. She was on her own. The next morning, she sent her resume to every airline she could find. She was willing to take any job: flight attendant, customer service, even baggage handling. But the responses were always the same. We appreciate your application, but at this time, we are pursuing other candidates. Your previous employment history does not align with our company's values. We do not believe you would be a good fit for our team. Karen gritted her teeth as she stared at the rejection emails piling up in her inbox. She had spent 10 years in the airline industry, and now no one would touch her. She had burned every bridge. Her pride had cost her everything. She thought she was just making one mistake. But now, she had lost her entire future. 3 months passed. Karen's savings were gone. She had been living off credit cards, barely keeping her head above water. Then, one day, as she mindlessly scrolled through job postings, she saw something that made her freeze. Carter Aviation launches Second Chance program for former airline employees. Her pulse spiked. She clicked on the article. Carter Aviation was offering a chance for former airline workers, even those who had been terminated, to apply for retraining. The only condition? They had to take full responsibility for their past mistakes. Karen sat back in her chair, her pride clashing with her desperation. She had spent months blaming everyone but herself. But deep down, she knew. She did this. She sighed and pulled up the application. For the first time in months, she typed something honest. I was wrong. I let my biases control my judgment, and I hurt people because of it. I'm ready to change. She hesitated before hitting send, but she had no other choice. 1 week later, Karen sat in Carter Aviation's headquarters. Across from her? James and Vanessa Carter. Karen's throat tightened. She had never expected to be sitting face to face with the people she had wronged. Vanessa folded her hands. Tell us why we should believe you've changed. Karen took a deep breath. Because losing everything showed me how much damage I caused. James studied her. And what do you expect from us? Karen swallowed. A chance, that's all. A long silence. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair. We'll hire you, but not as a flight attendant. Karen's heart jumped. Vanessa's gaze was sharp. You'll be part of our customer sensitivity training team, teaching others the mistake that ended your career. Karen froze. Her own failure was about to become her full-time job. Her chest tightened as the reality sank in. For the next few years, she would be teaching new employees how to avoid becoming her. And she knew this wasn't just a job, this was a test. If she failed again, she'd be finished for good. Marcus won today, but how many others never get the chance to fight back? How many people get judged unfairly, denied opportunities, or silenced before they even get to tell their side of the story? Justice shouldn't depend on power. It should depend on truth. If you believe in standing up against injustice, make sure to share this story and keep the conversation going. Because the fight isn't over, it's just beginning.